Virgin girl begs, mountain, man to hide her from dad. What happened next, shocked. In the dead of winter, a frightened young girl stumbles through the snow, pounding on a lonely cabin door. She falls at the feet of a towering mountain man, her voice breaking as she whispers, "Hide me from my daddy, or he'll kill me." But this isn't just a family quarrel. Her father is the most feared preacher in town, willing to sell his own daughter to powerful men for a piece of land. And in her satchel lies a deed, a secret so valuable it could change the future of the whole valley. Now the outcast mountain man must decide, pick up his rifle and fight, or lay it down and face a power no bullet can stop. The girl's life, her honor, and her mother's legacy all hang in the balance. When the church bell tolls and the guns are drawn, will mercy be enough to save them? Or will her father's wrath destroy them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The blizzard's fury rattled the tin roof of Isaac McCrae's line shack, each gust making the timbers creak like old bones. He stood at the pot-bellied stove, shoving another piece of split pine into its hungry mouth. The fire's warmth barely reached the corners of the one-room shelter, but it was all he had against the Colorado winter's bite. Shadows from the single lantern danced across the rough-hewn walls. Isaac's weathered hands, marked with scars from years of trapping and fighting, gripped the iron poker. The familiar weight of his rifle leaned against the wall nearby, always within reach, just as the war had taught him. The howling wind masked the sound at first. Then the door burst open with such force it slammed against the wall, letting in a swirl of snow and something else. A figure, small and desperate, tumbling onto his floorboards. Isaac's rifle was in his hands before he could think, muscle memory from darker days. But what lay before him was no threat. Just a girl, hardly more than 16, her dress torn and muddied, her shoes caked with snow. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and her lips were turning an alarming shade of blue. She crawled toward him on hands and knees, reaching for his boots with trembling fingers. "Please," she sobbed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hide me from my daddy. He'll kill me if he finds me." Isaac kept the rifle steady, though something in his chest tightened at her words. He'd seen enough terror in his time to know when it was genuine. The girl's eyes were wide with it, darting to the windows like a spooked deer. "Who's your father?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Deacon Elijah Holt," she managed between chattering teeth. "Please, sir, he wants to force me to marry. I can't. I won't." Her words dissolved into racking sobs. Isaac knew of Holt by reputation, a fire and brimstone preacher who held sway over the townfolk down in the valley. The man's sermons could be heard clear up to the timberline on quiet Sundays. "You're the deacon's daughter?" He lowered his rifle slowly. "Zoe Bell?" She nodded, her whole body shaking now. "I ran when he wasn't looking, through the creek to hide my trail, but the water was so cold." Her eyes began to roll back. Isaac caught her before she could collapse completely. Whatever trouble she was in, she'd freeze to death without help. He lifted her slight form, she weighed no more than a fawn, and laid her on his narrow bunk. "Can't have you dying in my cabin, girl," he muttered, pulling his worn wool blanket over her. "Bad for my reputation as a hermit." He moved to the stove, where a pot of rabbit broth had been simmering. The spoon clattered against the tin cup as he filled it, his hands less steady than he'd like to admit. How long had it been since he'd shared his space with another soul? Zoe Bell's teeth chattered as he helped her sit up enough to sip the broth. "Thank you," she whispered between careful swallows. "I didn't know where else to go. The other families in town, they all answer to my father." Isaac grunted, watching color slowly return to her face. That water could have killed you. Foolish thing to do. Better dead than married to Sherman Greeley. Her voice held a steel that surprised him. Father arranged it all, sold me like cattle, for Sherman's help getting the railroad through our land. The wind screamed outside, and Zoe Bell flinched at a particularly loud gust. Isaac found himself straining to hear anything else in that howl, hoofbeats, voices, the baying of tracking dogs. But the storm swallowed all other sounds. He settled into his chair, rifle across his knees. Your father likely won't be searching in this weather. Snow's coming down too hard. He didn't add that come morning, the storm would have erased her tracks completely. Zoe Bell clutched the cup with both hands, letting its warmth seep into her fingers. Mother would have never allowed this, she said softly. She taught me to stand up for what's right. Before she left. Isaac noted the careful way she said that last word. There was more to that story, but it wasn't his place to pry. He'd learned long ago that everyone carried their own burdens, their own quiet hurts. Get some rest, he said, turning to stoke the fire again. We'll figure out what's what come morning. She finished the broth and lay back, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders. I won't forget your kindness, Mr. McCrae. Isaac, he corrected, surprising himself. Just Isaac. The girl nodded, her eyes already growing heavy. Thank you, Isaac. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Isaac watched the fire's flames dance, listening to the storm rage outside. He'd spent years building walls around himself, keeping the world at arm's length. Now here he was, harboring a runaway from the most powerful man in the valley. His hand drifted to the old wound in his side, a reminder of the last time he'd tried to help someone. The war had taught him that good intentions often led to grief. But looking at Zoe Bell's face, peaceful now in sleep, he couldn't find it in himself to regret opening his door. The night stretched on, dark and wild. Isaac remained in his chair, rifle ready, watching both the girl and the windows. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountains, erasing all trace of Zoe Bell's desperate flight to his door. Whether that was mercy or judgment, only morning would tell. Gray dawn light crept through the frost-covered windows of Isaac's cabin. He stirred from his chair, neck stiff from keeping watch through the night. The fire had burned low, leaving the air inside the shack bitter cold. But something else caught his attention. Zoe's labored breathing from the bunk. Isaac crossed the creaking floorboards and pressed a calloused hand to her forehead. Heat radiated from her skin, and her face was flushed with fever. Her dark hair clung damply to her temples, and she muttered in restless sleep. Blast it all, he muttered, reaching for his copper pot. The creek would be frozen solid, but there was plenty of fresh snow outside. He unbarred the door carefully, scooping clean snow into the pot before returning to stoke the stove back to life. While the snow melted and began to boil, Isaac rummaged through his meager supplies. Years of living alone meant he kept only basic necessities, but he found a few dried willow bark strips, good for bringing down fever. His mother had taught him that, back before the war changed everything. Zoe's eyes fluttered open as he helped her sit up against his rolled bedroll. Everything hurts, she whispered, her voice rough. That creek water did its work, Isaac said, holding a tin cup to her lips. Drink this. Tastes awful, but it'll help with the fever. She grimaced at the bitter tea, but drank obediently. In the growing light, Isaac could see her more clearly than the night before. Despite her illness, there was something fierce in her bearing, a strength that reminded him of mountain streams, seemingly delicate but wearing a waystone through sheer persistence. Your father, Isaac said, settling back in his chair. Tell me more about what brought you here." Zoe's hands tightened around the cup. "He announced my engagement to Sherman Greeley 3 days ago, right after Sunday service, like it was God's own will." Her voice turned bitter. "Sherman's twice my age, with mean eyes and meaner hands, but he's got money and connections to the railroad men." "And your father wants those connections?" She nodded, then reached into a hidden pocket in her dress. "That's not all. Look at this." Her trembling fingers produced an oilcloth packet, carefully folded. Inside was a piece of paper, worn at the creases but clearly official. Isaac took it gently, reading by the pale morning light. "A land deed." "It was my mother's," Zoe said softly. 40 acres along Cottonwood Creek, inherited from her father. Good water rights, fertile soil. She always said it would be my dowry someday, so I'd never be beholden to any man. Her voice caught. "But father, he promised that land to Sherman and his railroad friends. They want to run tracks through it, dam up the creek for their water tower." Isaac knew Cottonwood Creek. It was the lifeblood of the valley, crucial for both farmers and ranchers. With the railroad coming through, that land would be worth a fortune. No wonder Deacon Holt was so set on controlling it. "Your mother," he said carefully. "She's passed on?" Something dark flickered across Zoe's face. 2 winters ago. A fever, father said. But she was never sick a day in her life until then. She looked down at her hands. After she was gone, he changed. The sermons got harsher. He started making deals with men like Sherman, caring more about power than people. Isaac had heard those sermons, carrying on the wind. Hellfire and damnation, sin and submission. He'd always steered clear of town on Sundays, wanting no part of such things. But he'd heard whispers about Deacon Holt, how he ruled his household with an iron fist, how those who crossed him often found themselves driven from the valley. A sound outside made them both freeze. Isaac moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the frost. His heart sank at what he saw. Fresh hoofprints in the new-fallen snow, leading past his cabin and up into the hills. At least 4 horses had passed by, their riders leaving clear tracks in the dawn light. "Scouts?" he said grimly, returning to check the door's heavy bar. "Your father's men, most likely. They're searching the high country." Zoe tried to stand, but swayed dangerously. "I have to go. I can't let them find me here. They'll hurt you for helping me." Isaac pressed her gently back onto the bunk. "You're in no condition to travel. That fever needs to break first." He added another log to the stove, considering their options. "Besides, going out now would just lead them straight to you. Better to wait until the snow covers those tracks." The day passed slowly. Isaac kept watch while tending to Zoe's fever, which gradually began to ease as the willow bark tea did its work. He heated more broth, coaxed her to eat a little dried venison, and listened as she dozed fitfully, sometimes calling out for her mother in her sleep. As evening approached, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of purple and gold, Isaac made his offer. "I could take you into town after dark," he said, checking her forehead again. The fever had finally broken. "I know some folks who'd help. Good people who don't answer to your father." But Zoe shook her head, clutching the deed to her chest. "Not yet. Please. Once they find me, I'll never escape again. Father will make sure of it." Her eyes met his, pleading. "Let me stay hidden, just until the danger passes. I'll work, earn my keep somehow." Isaac ran a hand through his graying hair, knowing he was about to make things complicated for himself. Deacon Holt wasn't a man who forgot or forgave easily. Harboring his runaway daughter, interfering with his plans for the railroad, these weren't the actions of a man who wanted a peaceful life. But looking at Zoe, seeing the same determination he'd once seen in his own wife's eyes before the war took her. He couldn't turn her away. "All right," he said gruffly, "but we'll need to be careful. No smoke during the day, no going outside. And if trouble comes—" "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you, Isaac. I won't forget this." He nodded, moving to bank the fire for the night. Outside, a lone coyote called to the rising moon, its cry echoing off the snow-covered peaks. Like that wild voice in the darkness, Isaac knew they were both now committed to a path that could lead anywhere, to freedom or disaster, depending on what tomorrow might bring. Morning brought clearer skies, though thick clouds still hung low over the mountains. Isaac watched Zoe through the cabin's frosted window as she struggled with an armload of firewood. She'd insisted on helping, despite his protests that she should rest another day. "You're splitting them too big," he called out, finally stepping outside. The cold air bit at his face as he approached her. "Here, let me show you." Zoe straightened, wiping sweat from her brow despite the chill. "I can manage," she said, but handed over the axe when he held out his hand. "Watch careful now," Isaac demonstrated, setting up a log. "You want to aim for the natural cracks? Let the wood's grain do half the work." The axe swung down in a clean arc, and the log split perfectly. "Smaller pieces catch easier and burn longer." Zoe nodded, taking back the axe. Her next swing was better, though the blade stuck halfway through. Isaac showed her how to work it free without straining herself. By the 10th log, she had found her rhythm. "You're a quick study," he admitted, gathering the split pieces. "Had to be," she replied, pausing to catch her breath. "After Mama passed, Father wouldn't pay for help. Said idle hands were the devil's workshop." She positioned another log. "So I learned to do for myself." They worked through the morning, the steady thunk of the axe keeping time with the drip of melting icicles. When the woodpile was decent, Isaac led her to the edge of the clearing where he kept his trap line. "Snares are better than shooting when you're laying low," he explained, demonstrating how to bend the flexible sapling. "No noise to draw attention, and they work while you sleep." His fingers, rough from years of similar work, moved deftly as he secured the wire loop. "Main thing is knowing where to set them. See these tracks here?" Zoe knelt beside him in the snow, studying the delicate impressions. "Rabbit? That's right. They're creatures of habit. Use the same paths most days." He showed her how to disguise the snare with leaves and twigs. "Check them morning and evening. Any longer, and the coyotes might beat you to it." They set 6 more snares along the tree line, Zoe's technique improving with each one. Isaac found himself impressed by her determination. Most folk from town would have balked at such work, especially a preacher's daughter. But there was something of the wild in her, like a young aspen tree, supple enough to bend with the storm, strong enough to spring back unchanged. As dusk approached, they returned to the cabin with their arms full of wood. Isaac showed her how to bank the fire to last through night, explaining each step. She absorbed it all, asking smart questions about draft and tinder. While he prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork, Zoe tidied the cabin's single room. Her fever had broken completely, and color had returned to her cheeks. As she worked, she began to hum softly, an old hymn that made Isaac's hands still over the cooking pot. "Know that one?" she asked, noticing his reaction. Isaac nodded slowly. "Sarah, my wife, she used to sing it." The words felt strange in his mouth, her name unused for so long. "Been years since I heard it." "Amazing Grace," Zoe said softly. "It was Mama's favorite too." She continued humming as she worked, the familiar melody filling the cabin with unexpected warmth. Isaac served their supper in tin plates, and they ate in comfortable silence. But the hymn had stirred something in him. Memories he'd locked away after Sarah's death. How she'd sing while mending his shirts, her voice clear as mountain water. The way she'd insisted on saying grace even when the war had left them with nearly nothing. The faith he'd abandoned when fever took her, leaving him alone with his anger at God. "Your mother," he said suddenly. "She taught you those hymns?" Zoe nodded, setting aside her empty plate. Every evening after supper, said music was a way to pray when words failed. Her expression darkened. Father forbade singing after she died. Said it was frivolous. Isaac thought of Deacon Holt, of his thundering sermons about submission and divine punishment. Even up here in his sanctuary, he'd heard tales of the preacher's iron rule over his congregation. Now, watching Zoe's face in the lamplight, he understood better why she'd fled. But even as they sat in his cabin's warmth, events were unfolding in town. He learned about them 2 days later, when he made his weekly trip for supplies. The general store fell quiet when he entered, and old Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter, hurrying past him to the door. Behind the counter, Tom Wilson wouldn't meet his eyes while measuring out coffee beans and flour. It wasn't until Isaac stepped into the livery stable that he heard the truth. Jake, the stable boy, pressed a crumpled paper into his hands. "They're saying awful things. Mr. McCrae," the boy whispered. "Deacon Holt's been telling everyone how you led Miss Zoe astray, corrupted her mind against her father and the church." Isaac smoothed out the paper, a wanted notice, freshly printed. His own name blazed across the top, the words beneath painting him as a kidnapper, a threat to decent folk. The reward listed would bring every bounty hunter in the territory sniffing around his cabin. "Sheriff's got copies," Jake continued. "They nailed one to the church door yesterday after services. Deacon Holt led the whole congregation in prayer against you." Isaac's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Much obliged for the warning, boy." He pressed a coin into Jake's hand. "Best forget you saw me today." The ride home was tense, each distant sound making him scan the trees for pursuit. But his trail remained empty, and he found Zoe safe at the cabin, the snares yielding 2 plump rabbits for their supper. He waited until after they'd eaten to show her the notice. Her hands trembled as she read it, but her voice was steel when she spoke. "He's trying to force me back. If he can't find me himself, he'll turn everyone against you until you give me up." "Could be safer if you left," Isaac said quietly. "I know people in Denver who'd help you start fresh, where he couldn't reach." But Zoe shook her head. "This land was my mother's dream for me. I won't let him steal that too." She looked up at him, fierce and determined. Unless you want me to go?" Isaac opened his mouth to agree. It would be simpler, safer for them both, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he watched as Zoe knelt beside his rough-hewn table, hands clasped in prayer. The lamplight caught her face, reminding him so strongly of Sarah that his chest ached. How long had it been since anyone prayed in this cabin? Since anyone brought music or warmth to his solitary life? He'd walled himself away from faith and fellowship after Sarah's death, but watching Zoe now, he felt those walls beginning to crack. Her whispered prayers filled the cabin, not with Holt's harsh judgments, but with the simple trust he remembered from better days. Trust in something larger than human cruelty, stronger than winter storms or loneliness. As the embers glowed low in the stove, Isaac made his decision. He'd protected nothing when Sarah died, too broken by grief to even try. But this time would be different. Whatever Holt might send against them, lies, lawmen, or winter's fury, Isaac would shield this girl who brought hymns back to his home. The cost didn't matter anymore. Some things were worth fighting for. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow as Isaac stepped out of the cabin. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a pristine white blanket across the mountainside. He adjusted the cinch on his old mule's saddle, checking the empty saddlebags that would soon hold supplies from town. "You sure you won't come closer to the cabin?" he asked Zoe, who stood wrapped in his spare wool coat. She shook her head firmly. "Better I stay hidden in the thicket while you're gone. If anyone follows you back, they won't find me near your place." She pointed to a dense patch of evergreens about 50 yards from the cabin. "I can watch the trail from there without being seen." Isaac frowned, but couldn't argue with her logic. "Keep the rifle close," he said, handing her his Winchester. "2 shots if there's trouble. I'll hear it." "I remember," she said, accepting the weapon with steady hands. She'd grown more confident in the past days, learning to handle tools and weapons with surprising skill. "Be careful in town." He watched her disappear into the thick trees before mounting up. The mule's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they started down the trail toward town. Isaac kept his eyes sharp, noting fresh tracks in the snow, deer mostly, but also boot prints that shouldn't have been there. Someone had been scouting these hills recently. The morning was well advanced when he rode into town. Main Street was busy with the usual traffic, wagons delivering goods, women shopping, men gathered outside the saloon. But something felt different. Conversations stopped as he passed. People turned away or hurried inside. He tied his mule outside the general store, boots creaking on the wooden sidewalk as he entered. The bell above the door chimed, and several customers looked up. Mrs. Peterson clutched her purchases closer and practically ran past him to the door. Behind the counter, Tom Wilson suddenly became very interested in reorganizing his shelf of canned goods. Isaac was reaching for a sack of flour when he spotted it, the wanted notice tacked to the bulletin board. His own name jumped out at him in bold letters. "Wanted for questioning, Isaac McCrae," in connection with the disappearance of Miss Zoe Bell Holt. The reward listed was enough to tempt any man in these hard times. He forced himself to read it calmly, though his jaw clenched at the lies. The notice painted him as a dangerous man who had led astray and forcibly detained the innocent daughter of their respected deacon. It urged citizens to report any sighting to Sheriff Dobson immediately. "Need anything else today, McCrae?" Tom's voice was strained, refusing to meet Isaac's eyes as he wrapped up the flour and some basic medical supplies. "Just these," Isaac said evenly, laying coins on the counter. The store had grown uncomfortably quiet, other customers finding excuses to leave. The bell chimed again, and heavy boots stepped inside. Sheriff Clay Dobson stood in the doorway, one hand resting casually near his holstered Colt. "Morning, Isaac," he said coldly. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." "Sheriff?" Isaac kept his voice neutral as he gathered his purchases. "Just restocking supplies. Heard you might have some company up at your place these days." Dobson's eyes were hard. "Deacon Holt's been asking about his daughter. Says she ran off after some disagreement." "Haven't seen her," Isaac said, "but seems to me a grown woman has the right to leave home if she chooses." "She's barely 18, Dobson countered, "and under her father's protection. If you're harboring her—" "You got proof of anything, Sheriff?" Isaac interrupted quietly. "Or just Holt's say-so?" Dobson's fingers drummed his gun belt. "Not yet. But I'm watching you, McCrae. Any hint you're involved in this, and I'll have deputies searching every inch of your property." Isaac nodded once and stepped past him onto the sidewalk. He could feel the sheriff's gaze boring into his back as he secured his supplies and mounted up. He kept his pace unhurried as he rode out of town, though every instinct screamed to hurry back to the cabin. The sun was high when he reached the creek crossing. Voices drifted from the thick brush beside the trail, 2 men speaking in low tones, Isaac reined his mule into the shadows of a large pine, listening. "Prime location for the spur line," one voice said. "Once Holt delivers the creek rights, we can start survey work." "You sure he can handle it?" the second man asked. "That daughter of his causing problems?" "He's got it covered. Already promised her hand to James Morton. You know, that investor from Denver. Morton gets the girl and her mother's land claim. We get our right of way, and Holt gets his cut of the profits. Everyone wins." "Except the girl," the second man chuckled darkly. "That's Holt's problem. He assured Mr. Morton she'll be at the altar next month, one way or another." Isaac waited until their voices faded before spurring his mule forward. His mind raced as he covered the remaining distance to the cabin. The conspiracy was worse than they'd imagined. Not just a controlling father, but powerful men with money and influence. They'd use every means to force Zoe into this marriage and seize her land. He whistled the agreed signal as he approached the thicket where she hid. After a moment, she emerged from the evergreens, rifle cradled professionally in her arms. Relief washed over her face when she saw him. "Any trouble?" she asked, falling into step beside him as they walked to the cabin. "Plenty," he said grimly. "Sheriff's watching for you, but that's not the worst of it." He secured his mule while she carried the supplies inside, then followed her into the cabin's warmth. Over cups of coffee, he told her everything: the wanted notice, Dobson's threats, and most importantly, the conversation he'd overheard. Zoe's face grew paler with each revelation. "James Morton," she whispered. "Father mentioned him at dinner last week, said he was coming to discuss business opportunities." Her hands trembled slightly. "I never imagined—" "Your father's promised you and your land to Morton," Isaac said quietly. "In exchange for creek rights the railroad needs. They're planning to build a spur line through here." Zoe set her cup down, hard, coffee sloshing over the rim. "He has no right. That land was Mama's. She left it to me in her will." "Which is why we need to act fast," Isaac said. "Your claim needs to be registered officially in Denver before they can challenge it. Once it's recorded in your name, they can't touch it without your consent." She stared into the fire for a long moment. "How long to reach Denver?" 4 days if we push hard. Longer if the weather turns." He studied her face in the fading daylight. "It won't be an easy journey, and they'll be watching the main roads." "I don't care," she said firmly. "I won't let them steal Mama's dream. Not for their railroad, and not for some stranger's greed." She turned to face him fully. "Will you help me get there?" Isaac nodded slowly. "We'll leave at first light. Take the old hunting trails where we can. I know some folks along the way who'll help us stay hidden." They spent the evening preparing, checking supplies, planning routes, discussing what they'd need for the journey. As darkness fell, Isaac added extra wood to the fire while Zoe sorted through the medical supplies he'd purchased. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for believing me, for helping. Most men wouldn't risk so much for a stranger." Isaac was quiet for a moment, remembering Sarah's voice singing hymns in their own cabin years ago. "Sometimes," he said finally, "doing right is worth the risk." The pale light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Isaac moved quietly through his cabin, gathering only the essentials they would need for the journey to Denver. Each item was chosen with careful consideration: dried beef and jerky wrapped in oilcloth, a small sack of flour, matches sealed in a tin, 2 thick wool blankets, and basic medical supplies. Zoe worked alongside him, her movements precise and determined. She had changed from her torn dress into borrowed clothes: Isaac's old trousers and flannel shirt, both too large but more practical for riding. Her long dark hair was braided tightly, tucked beneath a weathered hat. We travel light, Isaac explained, securing their provisions into saddlebags. Faster that way, and easier to move quiet if we need to. Zoe nodded, carefully folding her mother's land deed and tucking it into an inner pocket. How long to Denver? 4 days if the weather holds and we ain't followed. Isaac checked his rifle one final time before slinging it in its scabbard. Longer if we need to take the back trails. Your father's men will be watching the main roads. They led the animals out just as the sun cleared the ridge. Isaac's sturdy mountain horse stood patient while he helped Zoe mount. Then he swung up onto his sure-footed mule. The morning air bit sharp and clean, their breath forming clouds in the frozen stillness. As they rode higher into the mountains, following game trails and old hunting paths, Zoe's eyes grew wide at the vast landscape spreading before them. Living in town all her life, she had seen the peaks only as distant shadows. Now they rose around her like ancient guardians, their snow-capped summits piercing the crystal blue sky. It's beautiful, she breathed, gazing at a frozen waterfall that caught the morning light like diamonds. I never knew. Isaac watched her wonder with a slight smile. Different world up here. Harder in some ways, but cleaner. More honest? They picked their way carefully along narrow trails, the animals' hooves crunching through crusted snow. Isaac led them through stands of towering pines and across open meadows, always keeping to natural cover when possible. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the town was lost from view behind multiple ridgelines. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks when Isaac called a halt beside a half-frozen creek. We'll camp here, he said, helping Zoe dismount. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, but she moved without complaint. Good water source, and those rocks will block the wind. He showed her how to gather dry branches from beneath the snow, explaining which wood would burn best. Together they constructed a simple lean-to, weaving pine boughs for additional shelter. Zoe proved a quick study, her small hands working efficiently despite the cold. Like this? She asked, securing a branch with a length of twine. Perfect, Isaac nodded. You're a natural. The praise brought color to her wind-chapped cheeks, and, for the first time since she had burst into his cabin, she laughed. The sound was bright and clear in the mountain silence, startling a pair of snow buntings into flight. Isaac felt something warm stir in his chest, a protective instinct he thought long buried with his wife. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits, huddled close to their small fire as darkness settled over the mountains. Isaac told her about the stars wheeling overhead, pointing out constellations his grandfather had taught him to navigate by. Zoe listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed her quick mind. The night deepened, and with it came the bone-chilling cold of high altitude. They had just settled into their lean-to, wrapped in blankets, when Isaac's hand suddenly gripped Zoe's arm. She froze at his touch, instantly alert. Distant voices carried on the still air, accompanied by the jingle of tack and the hollow sound of hooves on frozen ground. Lantern light flickered along the ridge above their camp, moving slowly west to east. Searching. Isaac pulled Zoe closer, one hand covering her mouth to muffle her breathing. She pressed against him, trembling slightly but making no sound. Together they watched the lights weave between the trees, heard fragments of conversation carried on the wind. Tracks lead this way. Check the creek crossing. Reward's good if we find her. Minutes stretched like hours as the riders passed their position. Isaac counted at least 4 men, maybe more, all armed. Finally the sounds faded into the distance, but he kept Zoe close until he was certain they were alone again. Your father's men? She whispered. Probably some of them, Isaac replied grimly. Might be bounty hunters too, drawn by the reward. We'll need to be more careful tomorrow. Stick to the deepest cover, maybe travel some at night. Zoe's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing briefly. I'm sorry to bring this trouble on you. Ain't your fault, he said firmly. The trouble comes from men who'd steal a woman's rightful property and force her into marriage against her will. That's not the kind of thing decent folks stand by and watch happen. They took turns keeping watch through the remainder of the night, though neither slept much. As the sky began to lighten, they packed their small camp quickly and efficiently, erasing all signs of their presence. The morning was bitter cold, their breath freezing in their scarves as they mounted up. We'll follow the creek for a while, Isaac said, studying the terrain ahead. The water will hide our tracks if anyone doubles back this way. Then we'll cut east through the high country. Harder going, but less chance of being spotted. Zoe pulled her coat tighter, determination clear in her eyes despite her exhaustion. I'm ready. They urged their mounts forward into the growing dawn, both acutely aware that Deacon Holt's influence reached far beyond the town's boundaries. The wild mountains offered both refuge and danger, a place to hide, but also a place where accidents could happen far from witnessing eyes. Isaac watched the trail ahead while keeping his rifle close, knowing the next few days would test them both severely. The sun climbed higher as they rode, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Neither spoke much, conserving energy and staying alert for any sign of pursuit. But occasionally, when they crested a particularly beautiful ridge or passed through a grove of snow-laden aspens, Isaac would catch Zoe's expression of wonder and feel that protective warmth again. Whatever came, he knew he would see her safely to Denver, or die trying. After 2 grueling days of mountain travel, Isaac and Zoe spotted chimney smoke rising through the trees. The Waystation Inn emerged from the failing light, a sturdy 2-story structure of rough-hewn logs with warm lamplight glowing in its windows. Their mounts, exhausted from navigating treacherous passes, plodded the final 100 yards to the hitching post. Isaac dismounted stiffly, his joints protesting the long hours in the saddle. He helped Zoe down, steadying her as her legs trembled with fatigue. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and trail dust coated her borrowed clothes. Wait here, he murmured, leading their animals to the stable. Let me make sure it's safe first. Inside the inn's common room, a handful of travelers huddled near the stone fireplace, warming themselves with bowls of stew. Isaac approached the innkeeper, an older man with graying whiskers and shrewd eyes. Need a room, Isaac said quietly, keeping his voice low. For me and my... He hesitated briefly. My niece. The innkeeper's gaze flickered to the window where Zoe's silhouette waited. $2 silver. Includes breakfast and stable space. Isaac counted out the coins from his trapping earnings, precious savings he'd meant to use for winter supplies. The room key was heavy iron, marked with the number 3. He retrieved Zoe, guiding her through the common room with his body between her and the other guests. Their room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a chair beneath a shuttered window. A tin basin sat on a wooden stand, and a stub of candle waited unlit on the bedside table. Once the door was locked, Zoe sank onto the bed. What if bounty hunters come? She whispered, her voice tight with fear. Father has connections everywhere. He'll send men with guns and papers from the sheriff. Isaac propped his rifle against the wall within easy reach. Anyone tries coming through that door uninvited, they'll meet lead first. He checked the window's latch. Besides, most folks here are just passing through. Doubt news of your father's lies has spread this far yet. But he kept his powder dry and his rifle loaded, just in case. They ventured downstairs for supper, choosing a corner table away from other guests. The innkeeper's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, brought them bowls of rabbit stew and fresh bread. The warm food was a welcome change from trail rations. At nearby tables, travelers discussed business in Denver. Two merchants argued about recent court decisions, their voices carrying clearly in the quiet room. "Them judges don't care about right and wrong no more," one said bitterly. "Only about who's got the deepest pockets and the strongest friends." His companion nodded. "Heard tell of a widow lost her whole farm last month. Judge threw out her deed soon as some railroad man flashed silver." Zoe's spoon clattered against her bowl. She stared at Isaac, face pale. "The Denver courts. What if they're like that? Father has money, influence. What if they won't even look at Mama's deed?" Isaac reached across the table, covering her trembling hand with his calloused one. "Listen here," he said firmly. "I may not have much standing with fancy judges, but I've got something they can't ignore. The truth. I'll speak for you. Tell them how your father tried forcing you to marry against your will, how he's using false charges to hunt you down. Some men might be bought, but there's still good ones who'll stand against such wrong." "You'd do that," Zoe whispered. "Speak in court for me?" "Already told you. Decent folks don't stand by while others get wronged." His grip tightened reassuringly. "Won't let you face this alone." After supper, they returned to their room. The inn's thick walls muffled most sounds from outside, creating a cocoon of temporary safety. Zoe sat in the chair by the window, watching darkness settle over the mountains. Softly, almost to herself, she began to sing. The hymn was one her mother had taught her, about finding strength in times of trouble. Her clear voice lifted the simple melody, filling their small room with something pure and hopeful. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Isaac closed his eyes, memories of his wife singing the same hymn washing over him. Outside their door, footsteps paused. Through the gap beneath, they glimpsed the innkeeper's wife's skirts. She remained there, listening, until Zoe finished the final verse. When she finally walked away, they heard her sniffling quietly. The song seemed to release something in Zoe. Her shoulders straightened, and the fear in her eyes softened. "Thank you," she said to Isaac, "for believing in me, for helping me fight." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak past the tightness in his throat. Her mother's hymn had stirred something long dormant in his soul, a reminder that even in darkness, light could still shine through. They settled in for the night, Zoe taking the bed while Isaac made do with blankets on the floor. Despite his reassurances, he kept his rifle close and slept lightly, waking at every creak of the inn's timbers. Dawn arrived clear and cold. They broke their fast on hot porridge and coffee, then gathered their supplies. The innkeeper's wife pressed extra bread and cheese into Zoe's hands, patting her shoulder motherly. "God keep you safe, child," she whispered, then turned quickly away. Their mounts, rested and fed, stood ready in the stable. Isaac helped Zoe mount up, checking their gear one final time. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks gold, promising fair weather for travel. As they rode away from the inn, Zoe's posture was straighter, her chin lifted with fresh determination. Isaac's vow of support had given her new courage. Whatever awaited them in Denver, they would face it together. Mountain man and preacher's daughter, united against injustice. The trail ahead wound through pristine wilderness, each hoofprint carrying them closer to their confrontation with Deacon Holt and his powerful allies. But for now, their hearts were steadier, strengthened by a night of rest and the knowledge that even in their uncertain world, some people still chose to stand for what was right. The late afternoon sun glinted off Denver's church spires, as Isaac and Zoe rode into the bustling frontier city. After days of lonely mountain trails, the noise and movement overwhelmed their senses. Wagons clattered over wooden sidewalks, and soldiers in blue uniforms strode past busy storefronts. The air carried unfamiliar smells, fresh bread from bakeries, smoke from smithies, and the sharp tang of civilization. Isaac guided their mounts carefully through the crowded streets. His shoulders tensed at the press of so many people, but he kept his focus on their mission. Beside him, Zoe sat straight in her saddle, though her fingers twisted nervously in her horse's mane. There, Isaac pointed toward a solid brick building with white columns. That's the courthouse. They dismounted at a hitching post, and Isaac helped Zoe down. Her legs trembled, as much from nerves as fatigue. She clutched the oilskin packet holding her mother's deed close to her chest. "Ready?" Isaac asked quietly. Zoe nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Ready." Inside, the courthouse hallway echoed with boot steps and murmured conversations. Clerks hurried past carrying stacks of papers, while men in suits gathered in small groups, discussing business in low voices. Isaac and Zoe must have looked out of place, trail-worn and dusty among the well-dressed city folk. They found the land claims office, marked by a brass plate on the door. Behind a high desk, a clerk with ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed spectacles barely glanced up from his ledger. "State your business," he said wearily. "Need to register a land deed," Isaac replied, gently nudging Zoe forward. Her hands shook slightly as she unwrapped the oilskin, but her voice stayed steady. "It was my mother's property, 40 acres along Carter Creek, near Silver Falls." The clerk accepted the document, examining it with practiced eyes. He held it up to the window light, checking for authenticity marks. "Sarah Holt," he read from the signature line. "Your mother?" "Yes, sir. She passed 3 winters ago, but she meant the land for me." The clerk nodded, reaching for his registry book. But before he could open it, the office door burst open. 2 men in expensive suits strode in, followed by a third carrying a leather portfolio. "Hold there," the first man commanded. "That deed requires further examination." Isaac recognized the calculating look in their eyes. Holt's agents, arriving just in time to cause trouble. His hand instinctively moved toward his belt, though he carried no gun in the courthouse. The man with the portfolio stepped forward. "I represent certain interested parties who have concerns about this claim. The young lady's father, Deacon Elijah Holt, has already arranged for the property's transfer to more qualified owners." Zoe's face paled, but she lifted her chin. "My mother's deed came first. The land is legally mine." The clerk peered at the newcomers over his spectacles. "If you have competing documentation, present it now." The men exchanged glances. The one with the portfolio shuffled through his papers, but produced nothing definitive. "The girl's character is questionable," he tried instead. "She ran away from home, took up with an unsavory mountain man, hardly fit to manage valuable property." Isaac's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, the clerk rapped his knuckles sharply on the desk. "Character judgments are not my concern," he stated flatly. "I deal in legal documents, and this deed," he held up Zoe's paper, "bears all proper marks and seals. It was registered to Sarah Holt and witnessed by the county judge himself." He dipped his pen in ink. "Unless you have prior claim documentation, I see no reason to delay recording it." The men's faces darkened. The first one stepped closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Our employers are prepared to show their appreciation for careful consideration." The clerk's pen paused. For a moment, Isaac feared money would indeed outweigh justice. But then the clerk's tired eyes hardened. "Attempting to bribe a federal official is a serious offense, sir." His voice carried clearly through the office. I suggest you leave before I summon the marshal." The men withdrew, though not without venomous glares at Zoe and Isaac. The clerk waited until the door closed behind them before returning to his ledger. "Now then." He began writing in careful copperplate script. 40 acres, Carter Creek tract, transferred from Sarah Holt to her daughter. He looked up. "Your full name, miss?" "Zoe Bell Holt." The clerk recorded it, then sprinkled sand over the wet ink. With deliberate ceremony, he pressed the official stamp onto the page. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "There. The land is yours, legally registered and binding." He handed back the deed with a fresh copy of the registration. "Keep these safe." Zoe stared at the papers, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Outside the courthouse, she turned to Isaac, clutching the precious documents. "I can hardly believe it," she said. "For so long, I felt like I belonged to Father, like I was just something for him to trade away. But now—" She touched the papers wonderingly. "Now I belong to myself. I have a place that's truly mine." Isaac nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He'd felt the same way when he'd first claimed his own piece of mountain land, that fierce pride of ownership, of having somewhere to call home. The sun was setting by the time they found a respectable boarding house. The proprietor, a widow named Mrs. Chen, showed them to separate rooms on the second floor. After days of rough camping, the clean sheets and soft mattresses seemed like unimaginable luxury. They shared a quiet supper in the boarding house dining room. Zoe picked at her food at first, still processing the day's events. But gradually her natural enthusiasm returned. She began talking about her plans for the land. "I could plant wheat in the lower field," she mused, "and maybe an apple orchard on the south slope. Mother always wanted fruit trees." Her eyes sparkled. "Come spring, I'll put in a vegetable garden too. Can you imagine? My own garden, growing food I chose myself." Isaac listened, allowing himself a rare smile. Her excitement was infectious, and he found himself offering practical suggestions about soil preparation and water access. It felt comfortable, this sharing of knowledge and dreams. Almost like family. The thought surprised him. He'd been alone so long, he'd forgotten how it felt to care about someone else's future. But watching Zoe plan her new life, he realized their days of hiding together had forged a bond neither had expected. "You'll need help clearing that south slope," he heard himself saying. "Them apple trees won't plant themselves." Zoe's answering smile was brighter than the boarding house lamps. They both knew he was offering more than just labor. He was promising to stay nearby, to be the family she'd lost, and he'd forgotten how to be. Later, as evening shadows lengthened across Denver's streets, they sat in the boarding house's small parlor. The day's triumph had left them both drained but peaceful. Through the window, they could see the mountains rising dark against the sunset sky, beckoning them back to their wild home. Tomorrow they would start the journey back, ready to face whatever challenges awaited. But tonight, they rested in the quiet knowledge that justice had prevailed, that hope could overcome greed, and that sometimes family could be found in the most unexpected places. Dawn painted the Denver streets in pale gold as Isaac and Zoe prepared for their journey home. The boarding house's stable boy helped them load fresh supplies onto Isaac's mule, sacks of flour and beans, medical supplies, and ammunition for Isaac's rifle. Mrs. Chen, the kind-hearted proprietor, wrapped extra biscuits in a cloth for their first day's travel. "You take care now," she said, pressing the package into Zoe's hands. "Mountains can turn mighty fierce this time of year." Zoe tucked the biscuits into her saddlebag, her smile bright with newfound confidence. The deed to her land lay safely wrapped in oilskin against her heart. Isaac noticed how she stood straighter now, like a sapling finally getting proper sun. They set out as the city stirred to life, working folk hurrying to shops and offices. Soon the bustle of Denver fell behind them, replaced by the familiar silence of the wilderness. Their horses' hooves crunched through patches of old snow, and their breath steamed in the crisp morning air. Isaac kept their pace deliberately slow. No sense wearing out the animals, especially with his mule carrying their winter supplies. The creature plodded along behind them, occasionally snorting its displeasure at the cold. "Look there!" Zoe pointed to the ground beside a cluster of bare-branched aspens. "Deer tracks, ain't they? See how the front prints are longer than the back ones?" Isaac nodded, pleased she remembered his tracking lessons. "That's right. Doe and fawn, I reckon, heading down to lower ground before the weather turns. And those smaller marks beside them?" She leaned from her saddle, squinting. "Rabbit? Good eye, though those are a day old at least. See how the edges are starting to crumble?" Zoe beamed at his approval. She had taken to wilderness learning like a duck to water, soaking up every bit of knowledge Isaac shared. It reminded him of teaching young recruits during the war, before everything went wrong. But this was different. Better. This was about living, not dying. Around midday, they stopped by a creek to rest the animals and cook some food. Isaac showed Zoe how to build a proper cooking fire, stacking the wood to reflect heat toward their pot of beans. "Keep the flames low," he instructed. "Otherwise—" But he spoke too late. Zoe had already added too much kindling. The fire flared up, catching the pot's wire handle. Before either could grab it, the pot tipped, spilling beans into the flames with a loud hiss. "Oh!" Zoe clapped her hands over her mouth, dismayed. But then she caught Isaac's expression, a mixture of resignation and amusement, and burst out laughing. Her laughter was infectious, and soon Isaac found himself chuckling too. "Well," he said, wiping his eyes, "reckon that's one way to season a campfire." "At least we still have Mrs. Chen's biscuits," Zoe offered, still giggling as she retrieved them from her saddlebag. They shared the biscuits, watching the spoiled beans steam and pop in the flames. The sun had climbed high, warming the little hollow by the creek. It felt good to rest, to share simple food and easier laughter than either had known in too long. But Isaac's contentment shattered when he glimpsed movement along the ridgeline above them. Two riders, moving slow and staying just below the crest. Anyone else might have missed them, but Isaac's soldier's eyes caught the telltale shift of shadows where there shouldn't be any. He kept his voice casual, not wanting to frighten Zoe. "Best we pack up soon. Want to make a few more miles before dark." But as he helped her douse the fire, his mind raced through possibilities. The riders could be innocent travelers, but his gut said otherwise. They were moving too carefully, too purposefully, either Holt's men or hired guns, following them back toward home. Isaac's rifle lay within easy reach as they rode on. He'd loaded it fresh that morning, more from habit than any specific worry. Now he was glad of that habit. Still, he held back from any hostile action. No sense starting trouble if it could be avoided. Better to watch and wait, see what game these shadows meant to play. The afternoon wore on, and clouds began gathering over the peaks ahead. Isaac recognized the heavy gray bellies of snow clouds. They'd need to make camp soon, find somewhere defensible before the weather closed in. He chose their site carefully, a hollow tucked against a rocky outcrop, with clear views of the approaches and solid stone at their backs. As Zoe set up their lean-to, Isaac noticed the riders had disappeared. That worried him more than seeing them. Men who wanted to be seen usually wanted directions or company. Men who hid usually wanted something else. The first snowflakes began falling as they finished their evening meal. Zoe huddled close to their small fire, her face turned upward to watch the flakes dance in the firelight. Then, closing her eyes, she began to pray aloud. "Dear Lord," she said softly, "thank you for watching over us in Denver. Thank you for honest men like that clerk and good women like Mrs. Chen. Please keep us safe on this journey home. Watch over Isaac, who's been so kind to me. And—" she hesitated. "Please help my father find peace in his heart, even if he can't find it with me." Isaac listened, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. Part of him wanted to share her faith, to believe that prayers could turn aside whatever trouble followed them. But the soldier in him remembered other prayers, spoken in other dark nights, that hadn't stopped the bullets or the dying. He checked his rifle one last time, then settled in for his watch. "Get some sleep," he told Zoe. "I'll wake you if anything stirs." She nodded, already drowsy from the day's travel. Soon her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep, but Isaac remained alert, studying the darkness beyond their fire's glow. The snow fell steadier now, muffling all sound except the occasional pop of burning wood. Through the long hours until dawn, Isaac kept his vigil. Sometimes he caught the distant cry of a coyote or the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But no human sounds disturbed the night, no sign of their mysterious shadows on the ridge. Still, as the eastern sky began to lighten, Isaac couldn't shake his unease. The wilderness had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct told him their troubles weren't over. Whatever game Holt and his allies were playing, they wouldn't give up Zoe's land, or Zoe herself, without a fight. The snow had dusted everything white by first light, smoothing the rough edges of rock and wood into softer shapes. It made everything look clean and peaceful, but Isaac knew better. Sometimes the prettiest mornings held the greatest dangers. He watched Zoe stir, her face peaceful in the dawn light. She had trusted him with her safety, her future. Whatever came next, he would not let that trust be betrayed. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky as Isaac and Zoe picked their way through familiar mountain paths. Fresh snow from the morning had mostly melted, leaving the ground muddy and treacherous. Isaac's mule trudged behind them, its hooves squelching in the soft earth. "Almost home," Zoe said softly, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. After their victory in Denver, home had taken on new meaning. Would she return to town? Build on her mother's land? The questions hung between them, unspoken. Isaac kept his eyes moving, scanning the dense pine forest around them. Something felt wrong. The woods were too quiet, no bird song, no squirrel chatter. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. His years in the wilderness had taught him to trust such silence as a warning. They rounded a bend in the trail, the path narrowing between two rocky outcrops. Isaac's cabin lay just beyond, maybe half a mile further. He could almost smell the wood smoke from his stone chimney. The attack came without warning. Dark figures burst from behind the trees. Deacon Elijah Holt stood tall among them, his face twisted with righteous fury. 3 hired guns flanked him, their rifles already raised. "There's my wayward daughter," Holt's voice boomed across the clearing, "and her kidnapper." The first shot cracked through the air before Isaac could reach his rifle. White-hot pain exploded in his left shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. He hit the frozen ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Through blurring vision, he saw his horse bolt into the trees. "Isaac!" Zoe's scream pierced the air. She tried to turn her horse, but one of Holt's men grabbed her reins. Isaac forced himself to move, crawling toward a fallen log as more bullets splintered bark around him. Blood soaked his shirt, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his shoulder. But he had to reach his rifle, had to protect Zoe. "You ungrateful child," Holt's voice thundered as he seized Zoe's arm, yanking her roughly from the saddle. "Stealing your mother's deed, running off with this mountain devil! Let me go!" Zoe fought like a wildcat, clawing at her father's grip. "The land is mine! The court said—" The crack of Holt's hand across her face echoed through the clearing. Zoe crumpled, blood trickling from her lip. "The courts don't supersede a father's authority," Holt snarled, "or God's will." Isaac's fingers finally closed around his rifle. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he steadied the barrel on the log. The world swam in and out of focus, but he forced himself to aim. His first shot caught one of the hired guns in the arm. The man yelped, dropping his weapon. The others dove for cover, returning fire. Splinters flew as bullets chewed into Isaac's log shelter. "Kill him," Holt ordered, dragging a struggling Zoe toward their horses. "He's just a murderous deserter playing at redemption." Isaac fired again and again, trying to keep them pinned down, but his wounded shoulder made each shot agony, and darkness crept at the edges of his vision. Blood loss was taking its toll. Through the gun smoke, he watched helplessly as they forced Zoe onto a horse. She fought them every step, screaming his name until one of the men pressed a cloth over her mouth. Her struggles weakened, then stopped, as whatever drug they'd used took hold. "You should have stayed in your hole, McCrae," Holt called out as they mounted up. "Now you'll die alone, just like you deserve." More shots rang out, keeping Isaac down as they wheeled their horses around. He managed one last wild shot, but they were already galloping away, taking Zoe with them. The thunder of hooves faded into the gathering dusk. Then, as if nature herself mourned what had happened, snow began falling again. Heavy flakes drifted down, already beginning to cover the churned earth and bloody snow where the ambush had occurred. Isaac tried to stand, to follow, but his legs wouldn't obey. The world tilted crazily as he slumped against the log. His shoulder felt like it was on fire, and the rest of him was growing dangerously cold. He knew he had to move, to find shelter before the snow and blood loss killed him. But darkness was closing in fast. The last thing he saw was his own blood staining the pristine snow, spreading like a crimson flower beneath the falling flakes. Then consciousness slipped away, leaving him alone in the gathering storm. The snow fell steadily now, erasing all trace of Holt's men and their captive. It covered Isaac's still form with a white blanket, hiding him from the world as night descended on the mountain. Only the occasional drip of blood marred the perfect whiteness, marking where a good man had fallen, trying to protect an innocent soul from cruelty wrapped in righteousness. The first rays of dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of pink and gold. Isaac McCrae stirred weakly, his body half buried in fresh powder. The cold had seeped deep into his bones during the long night, and his wounded shoulder throbbed with each shallow breath. Consciousness returned slowly, bringing with it memories of the ambush and Zoe's capture. He tried to move and nearly blacked out again from the pain. Blood had frozen his shirt to the wound, and his left arm hung useless at his side. The temperature had dropped dangerously low overnight, leaving frost in his beard and a deathly numbness in his limbs. But something stronger than cold urged him to live, the thought of Zoe in her father's cruel hands. Inch by agonizing inch, Isaac dragged himself to his knees. The world spun sickeningly, but he forced himself to focus on his cabin, barely visible through the trees. Each step was torture as he stumbled through the deep snow, leaving a crimson trail behind him. Twice he fell, and twice he forced himself back up, though his vision blurred and his legs threatened to give out. The journey of half a mile took nearly 2 hours. By the time Isaac reached his cabin door, the sun had climbed high enough to start melting the fresh snow. His fingers were too numb to work the latch, so he shoulder-checked it open with his good side, collapsing onto the dirt floor inside. For long minutes he lay there, shivering, gathering what remained of his strength. The cabin was cold, the fire long dead, but at least he was out of the wind. When he could move again, Isaac crawled to the rough-hewn table where he kept his medical supplies. The whiskey bottle clattered against his teeth as he took a long pull, trying to warm his frozen core. Then, gritting his teeth, he poured a generous amount over his shoulder. The pain nearly made him pass out again, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was alive, and while he lived, he could help Zoe. With trembling fingers, Isaac tore strips from an old shirt, packing the wound as best he could. The bullet had gone clean through, which was a mercy, but he'd lost a lot of blood. As he worked, memories of his wife Sarah flooded back, her gentle hands tending his war wounds, her soft voice singing hymns to ease his fever dreams. "Forgiveness is strength," she'd whispered in those final days, when consumption had stolen her breath. "Promise me you'll remember that, Isaac. Mercy, not vengeance, heals the heart." He'd forgotten those words in his years of isolation, letting bitterness grow like weeds in an untended garden. But now, binding his wounds in the cold cabin, her wisdom returned with crystal clarity. Zoe needed him, not as an avenging angel dealing death, but as a protector strong enough to choose mercy over bloodshed. The next 2 days passed in a haze of pain and determination. Isaac forced himself to eat, to tend the fire, to keep his wound clean. He exercised his arm as much as he dared, knowing he'd need strength for what lay ahead. By the second evening, he could raise his rifle, though the effort left him sweating and shaking. Dawn of the third day found him saddling his old mule. The beast had returned home after the ambush, a blessing Isaac took as a sign from above. His shoulder still burned with every movement, but he'd fashioned a sling that helped support the weight of his arm. Supplies were minimal: water, hardtack, bandages, and his rifle. He prayed he wouldn't need the latter. The ride down from his mountain sanctuary was slow and careful. Isaac kept to the less-traveled paths, not wanting to risk another ambush. His mule picked its way surely through the melting snow, while he stayed alert, despite his weakness. Every hoofbeat jolted his wound, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him focused, reminded him of the price of failure. As he neared the valley where the town lay, Isaac began passing homesteads he'd avoided for years. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he caught snippets of conversation carried on the wind. Folks working their fields stopped to stare as he rode past, then huddled together, whispering. Poor Zoe Bell. Wedding on Sunday. Ain't right, but who'll stand against the deacon? Each whispered fragment stoked the anger in Isaac's heart, but he remembered Sarah's words and let the fury pass through him without taking root. Anger would make him careless, and Zoe needed clear thinking now. Near the miller's farm, he overheard 2 women talking as they hung washing. "Did you hear? Deacon Holt's got that railroad man coming Sunday after services. Gonna marry his girl right there in the church, willing or not. Ain't she underage still? Deacon says God's law supersedes man's law. Besides, sheriff won't cross him, not with that railroad money flowing." Isaac's hands tightened on the reins, but he kept his pace steady. Sunday. 3 days to stop a forced marriage, to face down not just Holt, but the money and influence behind him. The odds were long, but he'd faced worse in the war. More importantly, he'd learned since then. Violence would only beget violence, turning him into the monster Holt painted him as. No, this battle would require a different kind of strength, the courage to stand openly for truth, to trust in justice rather than gunpower. As the sun climbed toward noon, Isaac passed the last homestead before town. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat, but his mind was clear. He would confront Holt, yes, but not with bullets. He would speak truth in the light of day, before God and the whole town. Let them see who truly followed the path of righteousness. Sarah's final words echoed in his heart, stronger than any pain. Forgiveness is strength. He touched the crude bandage beneath his shirt, remembering Zoe's hymns by his fireplace, her quiet courage in the face of tyranny. She had awakened something in him that went beyond mere protection, a chance to reclaim the man he'd once been, before war and loss had driven him into the wilderness. The town's church steeple rose above the trees ahead, its white paint gleaming in the midday sun. Isaac straightened in his saddle, ignoring the protest from his wounded shoulder. Whatever came next, he would face it standing tall, armed with mercy rather than malice. For Zoe's sake, and for his own soul's healing, he would find a better way than violence to end this. The town of Mill Creek hummed with unusual activity as the Saturday sun began its slow descent behind the mountains. Ladies hurried between houses carrying covered dishes and borrowed tablecloths. Men hauled benches and tables toward the church, preparing for tomorrow's forced celebration. The autumn air carried whispers of discomfort, but no one dared speak openly against Deacon Holt's plans. Inside the church parlor, Zoe sat rigid in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Two stern-faced deacons stood guard by the door, their shadows stretching long across the worn floorboards. The room, normally used for ladies' socials and Bible study, felt more like a prison cell now. Its yellowed lace curtains and faded scripture samplers seemed to mock the appearance of propriety. Her father had confined her here since their return, allowing only the minister's wife to bring meals and help her dress. The elderly woman's hands had trembled as she'd buttoned Zoe into the white wedding gown that afternoon, but she'd said nothing about the bruises on Zoe's arms, where her father had gripped her. "The Lord sees your suffering, child," the minister's wife had whispered before leaving. "Keep faith." Zoe touched the cold window pane, watching darkness gather outside. Beyond the churchyard, she could see lights being strung between the trees for tomorrow's wedding feast. Her wedding feast. The thought made her stomach clench. Isaac's words came back to her, spoken during those precious days of freedom. God values your life, Zoe. Don't let anyone tell you different. She clung to that truth now, letting it shore up her wavering spirit. Her father might control her body, but he couldn't chain her soul. Through the wall, she heard the church door open and recognized her father's heavy tread. His voice carried, sharp with authority, as he directed the wedding preparations. Soon, that same voice would demand she speak vows to a stranger, a railroad investor whose money meant more to Deacon Holt than his daughter's happiness. Zoe pressed her forehead against the cool glass, no longer fighting the tears that slipped down her cheeks. "Please, Lord," she whispered, "please don't abandon me here." Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the churchyard in deep purple shadows. A cloaked figure moved carefully between them, staying close to the buildings. Isaac gritted his teeth against the pain in his shoulder as he made his way to the barn that backed up against the church's west wall. His wound protested every movement, but he forced himself to focus past the discomfort. The barn door wasn't locked. Few things were in Mill Creek, where trust between neighbors was still common currency. Isaac slipped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness. The familiar smells of hay and horse leather surrounded him as he picked his way past empty stalls. This close to sunset, the animals had already been led in for feeding and bedding down. He found what he was looking for at the back of the barn, a narrow space between the rough planks where the wood had warped over years of weather. Through this gap, he could see directly into the church parlor where Zoe was being held. The sight of her in that white dress, shoulders bent with grief, made his heart ache worse than his wound. "Zoe," he whispered, barely louder than a breath. "Zoe Bell." Her head lifted slightly, hope flickering across her tear-stained face. She glanced at her guards, but they remained fixed at their post by the door. Carefully, she shifted her chair closer to the wall. "Isaac?" Her voice was so soft he nearly missed it. "Is it really you?" "I'm here, child. I ain't leaving you to face this alone." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these seemed born more of relief than despair. "I knew you'd come. They said you were dead in the snow." "Takes more than a bullet to stop this old soldier." He tried to keep his tone light, though movement sent fresh fire through his shoulder. "You holding steady?" "Trying to." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "But Father means to marry me off tomorrow, right after services. The railroad man arrived this afternoon. He's staying at the hotel with his lawyers." "I heard tell of it." Isaac settled himself more comfortably against the barn wall, ignoring the protest from his wound. "Listen close now. Whatever happens tomorrow, you keep your faith strong. The Lord ain't abandoned you, and neither have I." "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if—" The parlor door opened, cutting off her words. Isaac saw her straighten quickly in her chair as Deacon Holt strode in. Even through the gap in the wall, the man's presence filled the small room with tension. "Still sulking, I see." Holt's voice carried clearly to Isaac's hiding place. "I trust you'll compose yourself properly by tomorrow. We wouldn't want to disappoint your intended." "He's not my intended." Zoe's voice was quiet but firm. "I never agreed to marry him." "Your agreement is not required." Holt moved closer to his daughter, his shadow falling across her like a prison bar. "This marriage will secure the future of our town. The railroad means prosperity for everyone. Your selfishness threatens all that." "Is it selfish to want to choose my own path?" Zoe's words carried an echo of steel that made Isaac proud. "Mother's land is mine by law now. The Denver courts—" "Silence!" Holt's hand struck the wall inches from where Isaac watched, making both Zoe and the deacons jump. "You will not mention that woman or her worthless deed again. Tomorrow you will speak your vows and sign the transfer papers, or so help me God, you'll regret your defiance." Isaac's fingers tightened on his rifle stock, but he held himself in check. Violence now would only make things worse. He had to trust in Providence, wait for the right moment when truth could be spoken in the light of day. "I'll leave you to your prayers," Holt continued, his voice settling back into its public smoothness. "Consider carefully your duty to your father and your town." He turned to the deacons. "See that she doesn't leave this room. Tomorrow morning the ladies will help her prepare for the ceremony." The door closed behind him with dreadful finality. Zoe remained still until his footsteps faded, then slumped in her chair. Her soft sobs carried through the wall, tearing at Isaac's heart. "Hold fast," he whispered. "The Lord ain't finished yet." She gave no sign of hearing him this time, but her crying gradually quieted. The deacons shifted their weight, uncomfortable but unmoved by her distress. Outside, the light had faded completely, leaving only lamp glow from the church windows to illuminate the yard. Isaac settled in to wait, his rifle across his knees. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him alert, focused on what needed doing. Come morning, he would face Deacon Holt and his railroad allies, not with violence, but with truth spoken plain before God and the whole town. He touched the rough bandage beneath his shirt, remembering Sarah's words about forgiveness being strength. The path ahead was unclear, but he felt a deeper certainty than he had in years. The Lord had led him this far, through war and loss, through wilderness and wounds. He would trust that same guidance now when it mattered most. Through the wall, he heard Zoe begin to hum softly, one of her mother's hymns that had so moved him by his cabin fire. The sweet, familiar notes carried hope even in darkness. Isaac closed his eyes, adding his own silent prayers to hers as night settled fully over Mill Creek. Sunlight streamed through the church's stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the wooden pews packed with townsfolk. Their Sunday best seemed at odds with the tension filling the small sanctuary. Women clutched their prayer books tight, while men shifted uneasily in their seats, all eyes fixed on Deacon Elijah Holt as he stood at the pulpit. "We gather today," Holt's voice rang out with practiced authority, "to witness a sacred union, one that will bring prosperity to our humble town through God's divine providence." His gaze swept over the congregation, challenging anyone to question his words. Near the front, the railroad investor sat with his lawyers, their city clothes and polished boots marking them as outsiders. They wore expressions of smug satisfaction, already counting their profits from the creek lands. Zoe stood before the altar in her white dress, face pale as morning frost, but chin lifted in silent defiance. Her hands trembled slightly where they gripped her mother's worn Bible, but her spine remained straight as a pine sapling refusing to bend in a storm. "It is written," Holt continued, his voice growing harder, "that children must honor their fathers, must submit to proper authority." He turned to face his daughter directly. "The time has come, Zoe Bell, to fulfill your duty to both family and community." The circuit preacher, Josiah Grant, sat to one side, discomfort evident in the way he gripped his own Bible. He had been summoned specifically to perform this ceremony, though rumors whispered he had tried to refuse. "Let us begin the ceremony." Holt gestured for the investor to step forward. "Mr. Harrison, if you would." The church doors creaked open. Every head turned as Isaac McCrae limped heavily down the center aisle. His coat was stained dark with blood at the shoulder, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. But his eyes burned bright and steady as he made his way forward, rifle held loosely in his good hand. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Several men half rose from their seats, uncertain whether to flee or fight. The railroad man's lawyers reached for hidden weapons. But Isaac didn't raise his rifle. Instead, he walked straight to the altar, each step measured and deliberate. When he reached the front, he laid his weapon down with careful reverence on the smooth wooden surface. "This here's a house of God," he said, his voice rough but carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Ain't right to bring violence into it." He turned to face the congregation, swaying slightly but holding his ground. "Just come to speak truth if you'll hear it." "Remove this man!" Holt thundered, but none of the deacons moved to obey. They had seen Isaac in town over the years, knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself. This deliberate peace in his bearing now held more power than any threat of violence. "This girl," Isaac continued, gesturing to Zoe, "ain't no man's property to trade or sell. She's God's child, same as any of us. Got her mother's spirit and her own strong heart." His gaze swept the crowd. "You all knew her mama. Know the kind woman she raised her daughter to be." Murmurs of agreement rustled through the pews. Many remembered Zoe's mother's kindness, her gentle faith that had touched so many lives before illness took her. "The law's done spoke its piece," Isaac said. "Denver courts verified that Creek land belongs to Zoe proper, through her mama's deed. Any man trying to force her hand now is standing against both law and gospel." "Lies!" Holt strode forward, face flushed with rage. "This mountain hermit has corrupted my daughter, turned her against her own blood. He has no right." "He has every right." Circuit Preacher Grant rose slowly to his feet, his quiet voice cutting through Holt's bluster. As does any person who stands for truth before God. He moved to join Isaac at the altar, laying a steadying hand on the wounded man's arm. I have watched too long as power was wielded like a whip in this town, scripture twisted to serve greed rather than grace. Holt's face purpled. You dare question my authority? I who have led this congregation for 15 years? Led through fear, Grant replied evenly. But perfect love casts out fear, brother, and I see more love in this man's willing surrender of his weapon than in all your fierce sermons. He turned to address the congregation directly. Good people of Mill Creek, you know in your hearts what is right. Will you stand silent while a daughter of this town is sold against her will? While God's word is used to justify the theft of her inheritance? The townsfolk stirred, exchanging glances. Old Mrs. Peterson, who had helped birth half the town's children, was the first to stand. I knew Sarah Holt, she declared firmly. Helped her plant her garden every spring. That creek land was her dream for her girl's future. Ain't right to take it, no matter how sweet the railroad money sounds. Others began rising. The smithy who had helped Sarah repair her fences, the shopkeeper who remembered her endless kindness during hard times, families who had been touched by her quiet faith. One by one, they stood in silent support of her daughter. This is outrageous! The railroad investor surged to his feet, his lawyers flanking him. We have contracts, agreements? Made under false pretenses, Grant interrupted calmly. With no legal authority, given the Denver court's ruling. He smiled slightly. I suspect your lawyers already know this, sir. They seem wise enough to recognize when a situation has shifted beyond salvage. Indeed, the city lawyers were already gathering their papers, expressions carefully neutral as they assessed the mood of the crowd. They had not built their careers by backing losing ventures. Zoe Bell. Isaac turned to her, his voice gentling. Ain't nobody here can tell you what path to take. That choice is yours alone, as God intended. Tears spilled down Zoe's cheeks, but she smiled as she stepped away from the altar to stand beside him. I choose freedom, she said clearly. I choose to honor my mother's legacy and my own heart. More townsfolk rose, nodding in approval. Holt stared in disbelief as his carefully constructed authority crumbled. The railroad man and his lawyers were already slipping toward the door, unwilling to waste more time on a clearly lost cause. This isn't over, Holt sputtered, but his words carried no weight now. The congregation had seen truth laid bare before them, not through violence or force, but through one man's willing surrender of weapons in favor of justice. Isaac swayed on his feet, the last of his strength fading. But Zoe was there to support him, her arms steady around his waist. Grant stepped forward to help, his weathered face creased with concern. Let's get you seen to, brother, the circuit preacher said kindly. That wound needs proper tending. He looked out over the congregation, now buzzing with purposeful energy. I believe we all have some healing to do as a community. Shall we begin with prayer? Heads bowed as Grant's voice rose in supplication, asking for guidance and wisdom in the days ahead. But through it all, Zoe kept her eyes on Isaac's face, seeing in his exhausted smile the same truth she had recognized that first desperate night at his cabin. Here was a man who understood that real strength lay not in power over others, but in the courage to stand for what was right. The morning sunlight continued to pour through the stained glass, painting them all in colors of hope and renewal. Chaos erupted in the church as the railroad investor fled, his coattails flapping behind him. His lawyers scrambled after him, clutching their briefcases, nearly tripping over their own feet in their haste to escape the collapsing scheme. The sound of their carriage wheels grinding against gravel echoed through the open church doors. The townswomen moved as one, forming a protective circle around Zoe. Mrs. Peterson's weathered hands gripped Zoe's shoulders, while the baker's wife, Sarah Mills, stood fierce as a mother bear before her. Others joined, their skirts rustling as they created a human shield between the girl and her father. Sheriff Dobson finally stepped forward, his badge catching the morning light streaming through the windows. He cleared his throat, fingering the brim of his hat as he found his voice. "Deacon Holt," he announced, the words coming stronger now. "I reckon you ain't fit to force any marriage here. That Denver court ruling makes it clear as day. This land belongs to your girl proper through her mama's deed." Holt staggered as if struck. His face, once purple with rage, drained to ash. His hands trembled as they clutched at empty air, his carefully constructed world of control crumbling around him. "You can't," he wheezed, but the words died in his throat. "We can, and we will," Mrs. Peterson declared firmly. "Lord, forgive us for staying quiet so long." Holt's knees buckled. He collapsed before the altar, his fine black suit gathering dust on the floorboards. The mighty deacon looked small now, broken, as his schemes unraveled in the harsh light of truth. A sudden movement drew everyone's attention. Isaac, who had been standing so strong despite his wound, swayed dangerously on his feet. The blood loss and exhaustion finally caught up with him, and his face went gray as paper. "Isaac!" Zoe broke free from the protective circle, rushing to his side just as his legs gave way. She caught him awkwardly, struggling under his weight until others hurried to help. "Get him to the boarding house," Mrs. Peterson commanded, taking charge. "Martha, run fetch Dr. Wilson. Mary will need clean bandages and hot water." The women moved with practiced efficiency, supporting Isaac between them as they guided him out of the church and down the street to the boarding house. The morning air was crisp and clean, as if the very weather celebrated truth's victory over deceit. Inside the boarding house, they settled Isaac onto a clean bed. His breath came in shallow gasps, his skin burning with fever as infection took hold in his shoulder wound. The doctor arrived quickly, his bag clutched in gnarled hands. "Should have tended this days ago," Dr. Wilson muttered, cleaning the wound with careful movements. "Bullet's still in there, needs to come out." Zoe gripped Isaac's hand as the doctor worked, her heart clenching each time pain made him flinch. The women formed a chain, passing fresh bandages and heated water, working together as naturally as they did during births and deaths, and all the moments that bound their community. Through the long night, Isaac drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever raging. In his delirium, he mumbled broken apologies for failing his wife, for the lives lost under his command during the war, for not being strong enough to protect Zoe sooner. "Hush now," Zoe soothed, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth. "You've given me everything, my life, my dignity, my freedom. Rest easy." "Should have been faster," he muttered, tossing restlessly. "Should have seen them coming." "You did everything right," Zoe insisted, her voice thick with tears. "You showed them all what real strength looks like, laying down that rifle in church. You trusted in the Lord's justice instead of man's violence." She squeezed his hand. "Now trust us to care for you, like family should." Mrs. Peterson, dozing in a chair nearby, smiled at the word family. She had seen enough of life to recognize when bonds stronger than blood were being forged. The way Zoe tended Isaac reminded her of Sarah, with that same gentle strength that could move mountains. Through the window, dawn began to paint the sky in gentle colors. The worst of Isaac's fever had broken, his breathing easier now. The doctor had removed the bullet and declared him likely to recover, though it would take time and care. Zoe still held his hand, humming her mother's hymns softly as the new day began. Outside, the town stirred to life, forever changed by truth's victory in their little church. But here in this quiet room, something more personal had transformed. Two lonely souls had found family in each other, bound by courage, faith, and love stronger than any legal deed. The mountain valley stirred with new life as spring's warmth melted winter's grip. Patches of green pushed through the softening earth, and the creek burbled with fresh snowmelt. Morning sunshine spilled across Zoe's 40 acres, turning dewdrops into diamonds on tender grass shoots. Near the creek bank, a dozen women worked the soil with hoes and spades. Mrs. Peterson directed the planting, her gray hair tucked under a faded bonnet as she showed 3 young widows how to space the vegetable seeds. Their children darted between the rows, dropping potato eyes into the furrows and giggling as they covered them with dark earth. "Mind you don't step on the seedlings, young ones," Mrs. Peterson called out, but her weathered face creased with joy at their laughter. It had been too long since children's voices rang free in their valley. The steady rhythm of hammering echoed across the field. Isaac worked deliberately on the schoolhouse frame, his wounded shoulder still tender but healing well. 2 retired carpenters had volunteered their expertise, teaching him proper joints and bracing. The simple building was taking shape. 4 walls, a steep roof to shed snow, and tall windows to catch the light. "We'll have it ready before first frost," Isaac declared, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes met Zoe's, and the ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. These days, those smiles came more often, softening the hard lines grief had carved in his face. Zoe stood at the edge of her land, watching it all unfold like a dream made real. Her mother's deed had brought more than just legal ownership. It had sparked hope in their community. Already 3 more widows had inquired about building small homes here, eager to join this growing haven. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh-turned earth and pine sap. Zoe tilted her face to the sky, tears pricking behind her closed eyes. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing us through the storm to this morning." She felt Isaac's solid presence before he spoke, his footsteps crunching on the thawing ground. "Reckon your mama would be proud," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. Seeing her land become a place of new beginnings. Together they surveyed the scene, women teaching each other farming wisdom, children playing freely, men sharing skills and strength to build something lasting. No more hiding, no more fear. The corrupt powers that had tried to steal this future lay broken, exposed by truth, and overcome by mercy. "We're home," Zoe said simply, her voice full. The word held such weight now, not just shelter, but belonging. Family forged in trials, community restored through courage. Isaac's smile bloomed full and real, years of isolation falling away like winter ice in the spring thaw. "That we are," he agreed. "That we surely are." The laughter of children rose again on the morning air as they chased each other through the fresh plowed fields. Hope planted deeper than any seed took root in the valley, promising a harvest of justice and joy in seasons to come. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.